Ear training is great. It allows you to hear so many different things in music. But when do you turn off and just enjoy the music? That's what we're answering today. So stay tuned. I recently had a question on my channel and I want to see if you resonate with this. Sometimes I find that if I'm not moved by the music, then I can analyze it pretty well. But if it's music I really like, I just get into the emotion of it, and I'm not really identifying any of the notes at all. It's like everything from ear training evaporates. It's not a bad thing though, as at the moment, I feel my ears are opening up more and more every day. That's great. Ear training does that. But sometimes I can get a bit obsessed with trying to identify all the notes. And I'm guessing other people may do this too. Or to put it another way, when do you just turn off and enjoy the music? Okay, so this is a difficult thing to answer, but I'm going to try and make it simple. So imagine you have a painting in front of you, and there are many different colors on there. You decide, I'm going to focus on this orange. I'm going to get really into the color orange. The orange is drawing me in. I feel this nostalgia, or I feel this peace. I feel an emotion when I look at this color orange. This is a part of the painting I really like. So you start to focus on that color, but you still see the other colors. They're vague. They kind of become in the background because your attention is now on one thing. And you are feeling this emotion coming from that color orange. Okay. But you're still aware vaguely of everything else. It wouldn't even take half a second for you to be able to say there's also greens, reds, purples, and blues in there. So you'd be able to identify the other colors in the painting, even if you're wrapped up in the overall emotion or a specific emotion in the painting. So now let's take this a step further. Let's say you have this orange, and now you're starting to see there's various hues of that orange. It's moving into yellow, but it's actually a little bit difficult. Now it's requiring some concentration because that orange, the clear, bright orange, is easy to see, easy to identify, but there's a very gradual fade into the color yellow. Where does it change from orange to yellow? Now you're using your brain. If you're not an artist and you're not used to working with color, then it would be harder for you to be able to say, this is the point where it changes. Okay, ear training is kind of the same thing. If I'm listening to music, I don't just suddenly turn off. I don't just suddenly turn off this ability to be able to hear things, but I can absolutely get wrapped up in the music. I can get chills listening to something that's really moving. Maybe I haven't heard before, maybe I've heard it many times before, and maybe it evokes strong emotions in me. But no matter how strong the emotions are, or if I get chills or I get a sensation from listening to the music, I'm still aware of the components that are being used to make that music, except when they're vague, except when they're advanced. So if I come across a piece that's not using very traditional chords, and for me, traditional at this point would be like major, minor, augmented, diminished, the seventh chords, things like that. It's when even quartal harmony and quintal harmony I hear pretty clearly. But if I just have a cluster, like 5 or 6 notes that don't necessarily make up something I have studied efficiently, then I will have to take a moment. I'll have to say, kind of like in the painting, where does it go from orange to yellow? What is this chord made up of? Now that could take me out of the music because it's something new and it's something I don't understand. So I have to take a moment and I have to say, what is this chord made up of? So if I'm actually listening to music, that's when I turn off. But when I turn off, it's more like that chord was a question mark. If it comes back again, guess what? I get a little more familiar with it. I get a little closer to understanding what it is. If it becomes a main motive in the piece, 10-minute piece, 5-minute piece, I'll probably be able to identify what it is by the end. But I'm not sitting there trying to analyze it. Because an interesting thing happens when you really develop a powerful ear. And I don't know if this is true for perfect pitch because I don't have it, but at least for relative pitch, which is what I have, what ends up happening is you start to recognize certain things in the music. You start to recognize components, but you don't necessarily identify them. So if I'm listening to a piece, I'll recognize a shape that if I take a second to think about, I know is a perfect fifth. I'll recognize a shape that I know is a major third or a perfect fourth. And so all these shapes, they start to sort of intermingle and create the fabric of the music. So I'm always aware of at least a shape that's going on in the music. But then I can take my lens and zoom in instantly and see more of what's going on in the music. But when I zoom in, maybe I miss some of the background because I'm starting to focus more on individual things. I'm focusing on the detail and I'm trying to identify what it is that I'm hearing. So I think that that is sort of an explanation for how I hear it, how I hear things. I don't think that ear training ever really turns off. Even if I'm half asleep and I hear music, I'm vaguely aware of the shapes that are coming at me. And so if I hear a shape that's a perfect fifth, I'll hear that shape every time I hear a perfect fifth. If I hear a chord that has like a minor second and then a fourth and then a sixth, that shape will maintain a certain shape in my mind. And once I identify it, then that shape is quickly recognizable. So, to put this another way, imagine you were building with colored blocks. I have this 2-year-old daughter, and she plays with blocks that are colored. I can look at the overall structure and appreciate it and say, that's a tower. And I can go deeper and I can say, here are the individual colors, the blocks that she chose, maybe even see a pattern that was used to build that tower. It doesn't take away from the fact that it is a tower. So this is one of the things that you can develop. And you need to understand, I am not born, I was not born with a good ear. I used to tell my students in college, I mean, when I was teaching at the university, I used to say, I think a lot of issues with universities that hire people to teach ear training is they hire people at the top of their field. I mean, if you're going to be a professor, you were generally one of those people that did really well in school. You loved academics. You were an overachiever. I mean, it's very rare to have a professor that landed a position and didn't at some point have this overachieving quality. It's kind of what makes them the way they are, makes them so dedicated to just studying and learning. And, that's not to say that that's necessarily a good thing because it blinds you to so much in the world. But I used to tell them a lot of times when students learn ear training, the professor doesn't necessarily know how to teach it because they never had to learn it. They developed it either so long ago or they developed it when they were so young, this ability to hear, that it's kind of second nature. And they kind of have this feeling that students just need to practice more or they just need to do more ear training assignments. And it's more than that. It's not that you have a bad ear, it's that you haven't been shown how to develop it. And some people have to be shown how to develop it. Myself, I honestly needed to be shown how to develop it, but I never found anybody that really taught me to develop my ear. The only thing they ever did was drills. And I had people that kind of introduced me to why it was important, why it was so necessary to have a good ear, but I never really had somebody sit down and say, this is what you need to do to get from point A to point B. So I figured most of that out for the large part on my own. But there were a few mentors along the way. So Virko Bali was my first composition instructor. And he's the one where I started to have a few conversations about audiation. I remember one time we were walking on campus. This is actually in my Technique Builder book, I think. But we were walking on campus and he asked me how the voices in my head were doing. And I said they were getting a lot better. And so we're in public, and I always thought this is kind of a weird thing because here we are talking about voices in my head. And if anybody who didn't understand the context was listening, what must they think, you know? But I remember having a few conversations, but it never ventured into the world of pedagogy. It was always, yeah, just keep doing it, figure it out. Then Daniel Asia at the University of Arizona, he spent 15 minutes of every one of my lessons doing ear training. And it was embarrassing because I couldn't identify these intervals. Now I'm a graduate student and I should be able to do this at this level, but I couldn't, you know? And so that's when I started to take it seriously. I created like 2,000 audio files because I was embarrassed. And I started to quiz myself because one of the things is, back then we didn't really have apps that taught ear training. They weren't great. They the sounds weren't great, and I just felt like they didn't work. So I created my own drills and I quizzed myself. And so this was kind of my process for developing an ear, and that was back in 2003 to maybe 2007. So that was a long time ago. So since then, I have developed a really powerful ear, but I didn't always have one. And so I actually know what it's like to experience music just by experiencing it and not really understanding what's going on. And also to have this experience where there's kind of this awareness in the back of your mind where you can't really turn it off. You always have some higher idea of what's going on. It's like this higher level of thinking that never goes away. But here's the trick about it. I think it only works with things you can easily recognize. So if you're listening to music and you don't kind of have this vague awareness of what's going on in the music, then that means you haven't trained your ear enough yet. I mean, that's just my opinion on this. But from my own experience, it went from, I don't know what's going on there. I didn't even really necessarily know if individual chords were major or minor, but I did know that a piece was generally major or minor. I mean, I wasn't completely tone deaf, but I was pretty close because, I mean, I couldn't even hear individual chords. Sometimes minor chords sounded major to me, you know? So I was a pretty bad case. And if I developed it, you can develop it. And so that's really why I created the Flawless course, and it's why I've done just about everything I've done. When I wrote my Elements in Music composition book, that was my first book. And I wrote it because I spent so much time trying to understand what a composer needed to know. And so while I offer a theory for composition in that book, and it's one that is only one of many theories, but it's a good one to help a composer start to learn to compose, because there's many ways we can do this, but I think the organic approach, it's an actual term in music, organicism. We use it in the sciences too, but in music, organicism means that basically everything grows out of a seed. So you have one idea and it sprouts and it turns into all these other ideas. And with intention, you develop a composition that makes sense. So the book is about that. But what I really wrote it as, how it started, was it was a collection of topics. It was, there's counterpoint, there's music theory, there's ear training, there's all these components, there's orchestration. And what I eventually did was I linked them all together to try and create sort of a unified theory of music composition, because that's one of the things that's actually missing. Arnold Schoenberg talked about this, but we teach theory by itself. We teach counterpoint by itself, and it's getting better now. We're now starting to integrate them more. We teach ear training in a bubble all by itself. We teach orchestration by itself. We never teach a student how all these different subjects actually link together. And if you don't know what counterpoint is, that's a prime example of what I'm talking about. When I was younger, I didn't know what it was either. I didn't know it was something you need to study. And so this book is really a primer for composers to know what subjects they should be studying. And then it provides a system, my system, for putting things together in an actual composition. And then the technique builder book, the next one I wrote, was to take it the step further, to give you the aural skills and the intellectual capacity to be able to hear the music you want to write. It was a composition technique builder, because when I was an undergraduate, I learned very quickly. I was going through Arnold Schoenberg's Theory of Harmony book, and I was following his examples, his exercises. He doesn't offer solutions, so you have to be very careful and really understand what's going on. But I started to work on that, and what I discovered was as I was writing the notes down, my brain was trying to hear what I was writing. And so then I took it a step further and I made sure that I was playing everything on the piano. And what happened was with all this repetition, I started to hear what I was writing. And more interestingly, what happened was it started to come out of my writing. It's not like I started to use the chord progressions I was learning, but the logic of creating these chord progressions made my music better. So I created these books as a way, going back to my previous thought, as a way of teaching others what I learned along the way, if that makes sense. So once I learned something, I wrote a book because I'm like, you know what? This goes back to when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I remember I was going to make a list of all the things that adults shouldn't do that upset kids because I was like, kids don't understand, or adults don't understand kids. And so I'm going to make a list so when I'm an adult, I understand kids. I get their point of view. And so I made this list. And as I was writing the list, though, something funny happened. I was writing it out and I was like, oh no, I don't agree with these rules anymore. I must be an adult. The list was never made, but I remember the intention behind it. And so I kind of do the same thing with my own training. As I learn something, once I've mastered it, I'm like, okay, it's fresh in your mind right now. This could help someone else. So I'm going to write it down. And whether you like it or not, it's my own experiences. And so they're there for you. You can actually follow my path. You can start with the elements of music composition, go on to the technique builder, get into flawless or the staff speaks if you need a little more information about music and just notation and things like that. And you can go through the same process I did because once I developed a good ear, guess what? Audiation became the new focal point. So I learned pretty quickly that you need to have both audiation and you need to have a good ear. So going back to the question, when do I just turn off and enjoy the music? I really don't. Uh, well, I need to rephrase that. I don't turn off, but I do enjoy the music. So when I'm listening to music, I'm aware of contour, I'm aware of shape. It's not difficult at all to take that awareness and turn it into a realization of what's going on. It's just like a tiny perspective change. So I'm always aware and it doesn't affect the music, but I actually think it makes it better because what happens when you're just listening to music, you're appreciating everything that's going on. You're getting wrapped up in the sound and the melodies. You're wrapped up in the music. And so you'd think that to focus on any other aspect of it would actually take you out of the music. But what ends up happening is you hear more and you hear these little characters that come back. Like I'm just going to make this simple, but let's say you hear a perfect fifth and that becomes a recurring motive that's used throughout the music. That becomes just like a familiar idea to you. It's no longer a perfect fifth. It's an idea that pops out, and every time you hear it, you can't not hear it. And it happens with all these different intervals and all these different chords. They become characters. You don't label them because labeling takes too much time. If I'm sitting here listening to music, I don't go, "Oh, that was a nice major to minor triad." And if you ask me to identify them, I'd have to say, "Okay, it was major going to minor." I might have to do that, but I don't have to sit there and turn it off. It's just there's always something there. And so there's something I wanted to talk about. I was trying to say this earlier, but I got distracted with my little stories here. When you develop a really good sense of relative pitch, something happens where you can't not hear every single note in a composition. You're more aware. If you've been doing the flawless course and you do the chord versus interval drill, a lot of you will say, okay, this is impossible. But then as you keep doing it, you start to more clearly, not perfectly necessarily, but more clearly hear the difference between when I play a chord or a perfect fifth. So your awareness has improved. Your awareness never goes away when you have a high level of relative pitch. So what actually happens here is rather than going away, it changes. It becomes more powerful in a way. Because rather than having to think, this is a chord progression, I think, I've heard that before. I know that shape. I recognize that shape. It comes back again here. So you're just more aware of what's going on. So going back to the question, I feel like everything from ear training evaporates. That was something this person said. So I don't think it evaporates. I mean, listen to music again. Well, if you're trying to pay attention, maybe it won't work. But listen to music again and try and determine, is it really evaporating? Or is it just that it's changing? Because it changes. When we are sitting here trying to audiate and then take what's in our head and put it on paper, we change it from music into like instructions, like a recipe. There's a perfect fifth with a major third, and I notate that. But when we're listening to music, it's still there, but we just see it as part of the mix. We see it as like a shadowy form within the music. So you don't have to get obsessed with trying to identify every single note, you know? Even with regular ear training, we don't have to do that. That's not If you're transcribing, that's really important, but when you're listening to music, you can just kind of enjoy it. You don't have to get too wrapped up in what am I actually hearing here. So we're going to talk about something else that's really important. There are some tricks in ear training that make it easier to hear what's going on. So if I sit here and I say perfect fifth, perfect fourth, major seven, dominant seven, minor seven, half diminished seven, that's a lot. If you're actually having to physically, think this is what that is, this is a quality, this is what this interval is, becomes overwhelming. So you need something that's a little bit simpler. And this is what we start to get into really in unit 4 and unit 5, but we start prepping the framework for that, I think, as early as unit 2 in the flawless course. So what happens is you need a system that allows you to quickly hear what's going on, something as intuitive as these shapes I'm talking about. So if I were to play kind of like a major chord here, that has a certain shape that's different from the minor chord. So if I hear another major chord come in later, and then I hear it in relation to the minor chord, that combined entity has a shape. Now, if I take it a step further, major, that becomes a grouping. And it's not a grouping that you have to memorize. It's not like we have to memorize all these groupings, but you'll hear it in the music and recognize it as a grouping. So the difference between ear training and actual music is that in ear training, we hear individual elements. In actual music, we hear groupings. And so One of the things that most ear training is missing is teaching you to hear and memorize groupings. It's not to say that I'm simply going to play 1451 and make you memorize what 1451 sounds like. We do that. But the end goal is not to memorize 1451 and to get a collection of chord progressions that you can call upon to identify things that are happening in music. Because that's not how real music works. Real music changes. In real music, it may be 1451, but we don't know what the soprano is. We don't know what the inner voices are doing. We don't know what the doublings are. There's infinite combinations of instrumentation. I mean, there's just so many combinations, maybe not infinite, but there are so many combinations. Even the tempo, when you take into account all the things that can change in a composition, it's a lot. Okay. So we have to develop an ear that can quickly grab new material and identify it as a grouping, not necessarily as this is what the chord progression is, but this is a particular grouping that I hear here, here, and here, and it keeps coming back. So that's what a lot of ear training misses. And that's why I think a lot of people who start doing ear training, they start to go crazy and try and identify every single note in the music. But that'll drive you crazy. If you're transcribing, then yeah, that's what you do. You take a composition, whether it's in your mind or notated, you use a program to slow it down, although AI will probably eventually do this for us, which is unfortunate because it's a valuable skill. It's one of these things that makes us better as musicians, but you take a program that can slow it down and you listen and you find each individual note and then you notate it. That is a really useful skill for ear training, but what we want is something faster. We want to be able to recognize what's going on and recognize relatively what's going on in the music. And so that's something that a little bit difficult to just teach right here in a podcast, but it's something that we eventually get into in the flawless course. We teach you how to take all these individual elements and create, use them practically. But it takes time. And so to answer your question and to kind of bring this to a close a little bit, I never turn it off. It just changes. And yes, I enjoy the music. I know you weren't asking if I enjoy music, but I think it can be easy for people to say, well, maybe he doesn't enjoy music. I don't want that skill. And that's the only thing I'll tell you is be careful of these tricks we play on ourselves. Where if something's difficult or it's going to take a lot of time to develop, we say, well, I don't need that skill. It's not worth the time. It is worth the time. And you probably do need that skill if you're a musician or even if you just want to understand music better. Having a good ear changes everything. And it's worth whatever it takes to get it. It's one of those things where, I'm not selling you a process. I'm not selling you time. I'm selling you a result. When you get my ear training and audiation courses, they may take a while to get through, but I don't care how much time it takes. What you are paying for when you get an ear training course is not one video after the next. This is something I think we need to keep in mind. We're not paying for 1,000 exercises. We're paying for a result. And so if you can do that in 5 exercises, or you can do it in 1,000, that's what you do, because if the result's what you want, you just have to do whatever it takes to get that result. And this is going to be what determines those who achieve between those who don't. I have a few students that are very dedicated. I would say almost too dedicated because some of them, there's this group where they won't go on to the next lesson until they get perfection. But I have to tell you, that'll slow you down because you don't want perfection in the flawless course. You want to keep moving, keep getting new stimuli. That's what's going to grow your ear. The constant reinforcement of old techniques with slightly changing parameters. So, to answer your question, enjoy the music, but be aware that when you're listening to music, your perception changes. It changes from one of analytical behavior to more nuanced, where you're almost seeing like shadows in the music. You're seeing structures, you're seeing forms, you're seeing components, you're noticing a weightiness, a lightness. And it when you have a good ear, it only takes a moment to turn that weightiness, that lightness, that colorless sound into something tangible. So, thank you for joining me today. I will see you next time with another question. We have another question I want to get to.